If you're like us, you've wondered what strong systems of support actually look like in practice. Schools need efficient, aligned systems that support all learners and lead to real growth. But how do Tier 1 instruction and Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions all work together?
In this episode, Stephanie Stollar and Sarah Brown, authors of MTSS for Reading Improvement, help to break it all down. They'll clear up common misconceptions about MTSS, share success stories, and offer practical tips to help your systems run smoothly so you can start seeing the growth you've been working toward.
Hi, everyone. Stephanie, we are so excited to have you back on the podcast, and you brought a friend and your co-author today, Sarah. We are so excited to talk to you both today all about MTSS.
Thank you both so much for inviting us.
Of course. Well, let's jump right in. I would love to just ground our listeners and ground this conversation in what we mean when we say systems level support, right? We're talking about MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. What do systems level support, or what does systems level support mean?
Yeah. So imagine that we heard about an accident, a car accident at an intersection in our town, right? We could ask questions about the first things that might pop to our mind are, was the driver distracted? Was somebody else, right, illegally in the intersection? Like, what happened? Right? We could ask questions like that. We could also take a step back and ask some questions from a system perspective. And we could say, how many accidents have been at this intersection this year? How does that compare to other intersections in our town with similar traffic patterns? And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about, in this book, taking a system level perspective. So the individual questions about individual students and how they're doing and how their programs are working, what they need next, are really important to have. But to get school-wide sustained improvement, we also need to really be honing in on some of those larger picture questions that are going to tell us overall what our system needs to support educators better to help all learners be successful readers.
I think it's those systems of support that need to circle around the classroom teacher and his or her students. So you think about the things like the daily schedule, things like how others in the school support the classroom teacher. You think about things like time to plan and meet together in teams, things like instructional materials, things like materials and processes around intervention that teachers can access for their students, the interaction between special education and general education, or multilingual support and general education. So those are some examples of some of the systems of support that surround that classroom. So as Sarah said, we're sort of zooming out and not expecting teachers to manage the success of their students on their own, but to think about that classroom as nested within these interacting systems within the school environment. And so we want to get people to think about and talk about how are the ways that they're doing business in those systems impacting that individual student learning? And how do we take an approach that's not just focused on one student at a time, but zoom out and get our systems lined up in place for every student to be successful?
That is really helpful. And my next question for you is about the difference between MTSS and intervention. And I feel like they're often used synonymously, right? They're the same thing. MTSS is intervention. But even just what you just shared in that little bit, I'm thinking that MTSS is this bigger picture zoomed out more than intervention might be included in that, but it's even more than that. Am I on the right track?
Yes, that's exactly right. So some people use response to intervention, or RTI, and MTSS interchangeably. But we sort of think about response to intervention as being, as you said, a component of the larger system. And it's the piece that schools don't often talk about and think about. They're only viewing MTSS in many cases as a set of forms, a set of meetings, a set of procedures for moving students through tiers of intervention. And you can't actually do that unless you have all of these other aspects of your school system functioning correctly, effectively, aligned with each other, and aligned with the research and what students need. So yes, you hit it right on the money.
So you'll see the different components, kind of key components of an MTSS framework as different things, but we think of them as things like the targeted interventions at every tier of support, right? So might be tier 1 interventions as well as those interventions that you mentioned. Part of it is collaboration and teaming and leadership around that. Part of it is the assessments that we have that help us answer the question and address our needs where we have them at the right time, and how we're making decisions using those interventions. And so there are different pieces. How they look in each school will be different, which is sometimes the tricky part, right? But it's also I think part of the beauty in an MTSS is that it can look differently depending on your system and your resources. But those components are there every time. My hobby is girls' trips. And I often say like the framework of a girls' trip, right? Like it's going to look different every time, but there's some things that we have to do every time. We have to decide where we're going to stay. We have to decide how we're going to get there. I personally have to decide where are we going to eat. Those are my favorite parts. And so, right. So those we're always going to have to, we can't skip any of those decisions. Those all have to be part of a successful girls' trip. And the same is true from an MTSS. If you're going to see a successful MTSS, you have to address each of these pieces of the framework, but how they look in your school might be different.
Yeah, Sarah, I think so much hits home for me there. I love the analogy. That's fun and also very true. But that's to me the stuff that is very frustrating to teachers. Like I think when we hear from a lot of teachers, the things that they're frustrated with are not necessarily the classroom teaching, right? Like the majority of teachers that come to me and Melissa asking questions, and I'm sure come to you all, I see you nodding, they love working with students. Like teachers love teaching. And I will say the same too, when I was in the classroom, the part that was frustrating was typically not the teaching part. It was all the other stuff surrounding it that were broken systems that were very, very tricky to work with because you're working within a broken system and then broken systems don't necessarily function to the highest quality. So I'm thinking now we've kind of set this foundation and an understanding here of systems and of MTSS versus intervention. So we thought we would jump into some questions from listeners, questions that we're hearing from teachers every day. Does that sound good to you both? All right. So we hear teachers asking this question. We've learned about the science of reading, but I'm not seeing results translate into student growth. What do you suggest? Yeah.
So the part that is central to MTSS that we don't always see schools doing is elevating the barriers. So for classroom teachers to surface what's in their way, and for the rest of the educators in the school and district to understand that their role is to help eliminate those barriers for the teacher to be successful in their classroom. So for us, we use a specific database decision-making framework in our book, the collaborative improvement cycle, that is the meat and potatoes of MTSS. And again, it's something we don't always see happening. Even when schools or districts say they're doing MTSS, they're not getting together in these collaborative teams to use their assessments in a structured decision-making process. So our book is really oriented to support people to make that shift, and lots of tools, meeting agendas, templates for having those conversations. There are often meetings in schools, but people are not talking about this. And we want to really direct people to surfacing the barriers. What would teachers say is in their way? Why are they not getting better results? What's in their way? And then systematically, as a collaborative group, writing action plans to eliminate those barriers. We don't want the science of reading to be these one-off actions. Like all we have to do is get some professional development and then we're done. We're good to go. All we have to do is adopt some new program and then everything's going to be different. That's what people are experiencing is not happening. And from our experience, we could have told you that would be the case. So we want people to have the right expectations that it's not these simple actions. You can't expect to continue to operate in the same way in your school and expect a different outcome.
Yeah. I think everything Stephanie said, I agree with. Another thing that I see, like in terms of why schools aren't getting outcomes and teachers, reading specialists, they're frustrated by that, right? Like they've done the things, they've invested a lot of time and money in this work, I see two things happening regularly. One is that the teachers, we haven't necessarily connected the learning that teachers have done through about science of reading to their curricular materials. And so if you are an expert, if you are listening to podcasts like this fantastic one, right, then you might be thinking about that and doing that naturally on your own. But it takes work to do. And so how are we as a system, as Stephanie's saying, right, supporting teachers to be able to do that? The second thing that I see is that we're still approaching supporting students student by student. And so in schools where we have large numbers of students who need additional support, who are at-risk readers, we're still trying to provide all of them additional intervention. When in reality, like in order to get really large gains as a system, we also need to look at what we're doing as tier one in terms of what I would call tier one intervention at that first class-wide level in order to accelerate overall learning. So those are two common barriers that I see. And I agree with everything Stephanie said, that I would use data and conversations with teachers to identify what are the specific barriers in our school and how do we do that. Those are two common ones I see.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm also thinking now, another question we get a lot is about, I'm trying all these things, we're doing all these interventions, but the data isn't showing it. And, or like we tried it and like the data even went down, like there was a little dip in our data. And I'm wondering, oftentimes I feel like what we hear is people like, okay, what's next, right? Like we're going to throw those things out and we got to try a new thing. But I'm wondering, like, what should people be doing differently in terms of like looking at their data if they're not seeing the success that they hoped for by implementing these things that they thought were going to work?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is stay the course. If you're using something that is evidence-based, then let your data and then the conversations around those data help you identify specifically what are the barriers to those things being successful right now and how can we address those barriers. When you started by talking about intervention, I'll just give a brief example from our book about how we would suggest doing that. So instead of starting intervention conversations looking at student by student and saying, okay, this student didn't make enough progress, what do we need to change? Okay, this student didn't make enough progress, what do we need to change? Look at the intervention as a whole and say, okay, if there were 7 students getting this intervention and 5 of them didn't make enough progress, we actually need to talk about the intervention itself, not about these students, right? And figure out what the barrier is. Maybe the interventionist was being pulled regularly to sub and we just weren't getting through an intervention. Or maybe we can only meet a couple times a week for 15 minutes a day because we have so many students we're trying to serve and we're really only getting through about a lesson a week, right? I wouldn't expect really great growth from that. And so thinking about and taking a step back and looking at what are our data and why aren't we seeing success? Most of the time, there's something related to implementation or because schools are hard, complex places, or dosage, like being able to get enough of that really good stuff we're teaching and that we see. There are other things too, but those are two really common ones.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's the reality of it, right, Sarah? That's the real stuff. Like you can put the stuff on paper and the goals, but then in reality, it's like there's somebody out sick and we need to pull this person for that. And then we're not getting the dosage that we thought we were. And on paper, it looks like this, but then reality says this, and there's a big gap. So I'm so glad that you pointed that out because I feel like that's the reality of every teacher's life, right?
And it's no
one's fault.
No, I was just going to add that in the book, we try to help people understand that the reality isn't going anywhere. Your reality isn't going to change. You have to work within your reality, right?
Oh,
so sometimes
so good.
Sometimes people throw up their hands like we can't even do MTSS in our school because of our reality. And we want people to understand this is the process of continually revisiting your data, revisiting your implementation, and making adjustments and improvements over time to get a different result. So I think just being very upfront about that is important.
Yes. I think of it so much in terms of like the analogy of like a health and fitness, right? If you're looking to add some exercise to your schedule and you only have, you've 30 minutes a day, but you're not doing any at this point. You don't start with those full 30 minutes. You start with 5 or 10 and you build up from there and you get momentum and you work within your reality. And then perhaps once you've got 30 going, for a long while, you're like, okay, I actually could do a little bit more because my systems now have shifted, or maybe 30 is good. And maybe I want to tackle something else. So that's such a good point to work within your reality. And I think that that's actually the thing that is the big barrier, that is the miss, right?
So if you're trying to adopt those healthy behaviors, you would have some way of measuring. Did you make any progress? You might have a coach. You might have to adjust your schedule. You might buy some new equipment that helps you, right? Like to accomplish that. You might have some incentives built in to that or some consequences built into that. All of those supports will help you make that behavioral change. And everybody can relate to that with some kind of, analogy like some healthy behavior. Same is true for changing the way we teach reading and our reading outcomes in schools.
Yeah. And such a good point. Like, say there's a day where there's a miss. That doesn't mean that then every day forward, we're just like, oh, well, whatever. It's like, make a plan for failure, right? Because there will be that failure there. So,
and how do we create the culture where it's okay to say, I planned on 30 minutes a day for this, but it's really not happening. And I have this group and I'm really trying to get them some extra practice in, reading connected text. And I'm just not getting to it, or, it doesn't seem like they're ready for these books or whatever it is. Like, we need to create a culture where we feel confident to say I'm winning, right? Like, here are my wins, but also that we feel confident saying, like, here are the things that are hard for me right now. And I need.
Yes. Okay. So along those lines, I think this is kind of a difficult question I'm going to ask you, but we get this question and I'm sure you do too. How do you recommend leaders respond when people in the system are not doing what they said they would do or what they agreed to do? I know there's those meetings that happen and it's like, we're going to invigorate everyone to do this. And then, people are like, oh my gosh, yet again, there's this other thing that's happening and I don't really want to do this. So I guess how can we be supportive of teachers and support staff who might be the only ones who see a path forward, right? There's a teacher listening who's like, I am one of the only ones doing what I said I would do. And then there are teachers around me who perhaps aren't. And I think this is tricky because we say no or yes to things for a variety of reasons. So I just want to say that there's no shame in this question, it's an honest question. So how do we respond as leaders? And how can we support teachers too who are out here listening? Like, I'm one of those yes people and I'm on board, but there's other people around me who perhaps aren't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think,
Stephanie, I'm going to answer the first part about the leaders. And then I wonder if because I think we've talked about this before. So as a leader, the first thing to think about is this the same way we would with students? Is it a student issue or a system issue? The same thing I'll ask about implementation of change. Is it one or two teachers who are struggling to implement, or is it most teachers? If it's the scenario that it's most teachers, then we have a system need, right? And when we think about doing new things, like I'm just going to go back to motivation theory, right? Expectancy, value, and cost. So do our teachers expect that they will be successful if they implement and make these changes? And there's lots of reasons we can expect that it might not be successful. Maybe I'm not confident with the skills or the materials that I have or the time that I have to teach it in or the student needs in my class. Maybe I don't expect it because I haven't ever actually seen it be successful. I've never actually seen students who started the year at risk grow enough not to be at risk, right? So that's the expectancy. Value is, how valuable is this to me to do? So is it worth my effort? And then cost is, what am I giving up? And I think thinking about all of those things as a leader is important to consider. Okay, if we've identified that this is a system level issue in our building, then I need to identify what are the reasons that teachers aren't able to talk to teachers and listen to them. And then build the supports and give them what they need in order to be able to support students.
I agree with that. I think the leaders have to set the vision and they have to stay the course. They have to have a way to get everybody on board with the urgency for change. And just about every school in our country has that urgency because so many students are struggling readers or at-risk readers. So setting the expectation, setting a vision for change, creating a plan that people have had input in so that they're going to buy into it. It's not something that's put upon them from the outside or from the top. So giving teachers and all educators a voice into what is the plan, but then really sticking to it. And the administrator not changing course when people are disgruntled or unhappy or pushing back or not doing what everybody agreed to do, but recognize, as Sarah said, that just is, it means the conditions around those folks are not such that they are supported to do the thing for whatever reason. So as Sarah said, ask them, why they're not doing it. Ask them what they need to do it. Don't let them just cycle in complaining and spinning their wheels, but remind them that this is what we all agreed that we were going to do, but how can I support you to do it? Because it seems to be a struggle for you for whatever reason. So those are the kinds of conversations I've found to be most helpful, because change is hard. And as we've already said, changing people's behavior about teaching reading is not any easier than any other behavior change. So we shouldn't expect that just because we have a new district policy, everybody's going to jump on board gleefully doing all of the new things and know what they should stop doing so that they can start doing the new things. Like, we just have to get our expectations lined up and realistic.
I really love that idea of just asking teachers and listening to the why, because like Lori said earlier, I mean, teachers want to do a good job. No one shows up at their job every day and says, like, I just don't want to do it, right? If they're not doing a thing, there's definitely probably a reason behind the why they're not doing it. So to hear it instead of, I mean, I feel like what happens usually is people just say, like, they like say it louder, like, you have to do this thing. And like, that's not going to work. Just telling me more and more that I have to do this isn't helping the whatever it is that's getting in the way of me actually being able to do it, whether it's time or people or resources. Something's probably getting in the way.
That's the purpose of those collaborative teams and using the collaborative improvement cycle. That is the venue for people to speak up and for the ask of why are you not doing the thing that we planned, and for the additional supports to be put around those teachers.
And I'm so curious about, I know most of our listeners are teachers, and I'm wondering, it sounds like leaders have a huge role in making this work. But if you're a teacher in a place where you want this to be going well, right? You want the systems to be going well, but they're not. Do you have any advice for teachers about how they can, maybe step up or talk to their leaders or do something within a place where it's not working well?
Yeah, we wrote the first section of the book, the first 3 chapters, for school leaders who maybe haven't had the same opportunities to learn about the science of reading or learn about MTSS. So that's a resource that teachers can point their school leaders to. I think in my experience, what's worked well for teachers to sort of light a spark for change in their system is 2 things. Find a buddy so that it's not just you. Because when you feel like you're the lone ranger who's trying to make this change, it's very lonely and it feels very discouraging. So find somebody else who's like-minded, who's interested in facilitating this change. And then find out what your school leader is interested in. So again, asking leaders to change is not any easier than asking teachers to change. So you have to understand it from their perspective. One of the things that happens when teachers learn about the science of reading is they get on fire. Like, I've seen this over and over and over again. They have learned a bunch. They know more in some cases than their building administrators and district administrators about the science of reading. And they get so excited about it. And then they sort of bulldoze over people. They want them to know all the things at once, and they want to implement all the things at the same time. And that doesn't work, because that's threatening to the school leaders in many cases, because it points out maybe the gaps in their knowledge, and it's putting a lot of change in front of them that they might not be comfortable to lead. So recognizing what is it that the school leader is already setting for themselves as a goal. So all building principals have like reading achievement goals. Every district administrator has some kind of literacy improvement goal. Many states are, putting these kinds of accountability frameworks on schools and districts. So if you can find a way to connect the change that you'd like to see in your school to the existing goals that your school leaders are already trying to accomplish, then you will not be this annoying, overbearing, threatening force in the school. You will be seen as the person who is trying to help that leader meet their existing goals. So maybe that sounds manipulative. I don't look at it that way. I think it's just human nature that every educator is busy and potentially overwhelmed. You don't want to contribute to that with your enthusiasm about the science of reading. You want to become the person who is a trusted, knowledgeable partner who can sort of come alongside those leaders.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Didn't sound manipulative to me.
Good.
Sounded very smart. Sarah, anything you want to add to that?
No, I agree.
All right. So that's so smart. I hear you saying too that like MTSS is very efficient and will be helpful at all levels, right? So if I'm a teacher, I'm looking to help, I'm going to just zoom in on what my administrator, what my district leader, they're already focusing on. So smart. So when I think about efficiency, I also think about classroom teachers listening and doing this work, and they might be feeling overwhelmed. How can teachers do this work so it's like the most efficient and not overwhelming to them? So maybe like let's elevate that triangle of efficiency here.
Yeah. A couple ideas. So one is I would lean on a collaborative network, right? So it might be like Stephanie said, right? Your buddy who's kind of working, like you're doing this with, but also your grade level team, assuming you have, right, that or kind of cross grade level team if you're at a single section school. And really be using, so we provide agendas and data protocols in the book. I think that takes a lot of the kind of prep work out of those conversations, right? If I'm using universal screening data 3 times a year and I'm running every day to plan and do things, I don't necessarily be knowing, which report am I supposed to pull up? What questions do I want to ask as I look at these screening data, right? What that looks like. And so we've tried to help teams by providing some of that to make it a little bit more doable. And then for the day-to-day, I would be like using that collaborative network that I have. I find in most schools that I go to around the country that teams are really used to talking about standards and what they're going to teach, but less used to having conversations about how they teach. And then like day-to-day, what that's going to look like. And that can be a huge support to teachers to make their planning more efficient, to make their outcomes more effective when they're able to have those types of conversations within their grade level team or their PLC.
One of the great efficiencies in the MTSS model is the fact that we zoom out and don't just look at individual students. So I would encourage teachers to adopt that perspective. And rather than looking at their screening data to identify the individuals who are struggling, to look for the patterns. So what percentage of students in your class are struggling to read text for meaning? What percentage are struggling with basic decoding or phonemic awareness? So look for those trends and patterns and then approach the magnitude of that problem either with a class-wide strategy or with grouping students who have the same concern. In many of the old RTI applications, teachers would look at screening data and then make a referral for intervention for every individual student, right? And that is surely overwhelming. It's overwhelming to the teacher. It's overwhelming to the intervention system. So the alternative to that we really elevate in MTSS is, does anybody else score in this same way? And again, look in your classroom, but also if you have a partner first grade teacher or a grade level team, ask during that meeting, hey, I've got 2 kids who are really struggling to read text accurately and fluently. Does anybody else have kids who are struggling with that, right? And so then take that on together rather than each individual teacher thinking that they have to support individual students. Look for the opportunities to build in those class-wide routines and approaches to instruction when you see patterns and multiple students who have the same need.
Yeah, and this comes back to what I talked about. MTSS and intervention often get, put in the same bucket. And I think oftentimes we don't think of what do you do for tier 1 in this, right? And you guys mentioned that this intervention and differentiation can happen in tier 1, right? You don't have to wait until tier 2 and tier 3 and have it all happen there. Because like you said, it's just too many students to do all that work. It's too overwhelming and not efficient in any way.
The best approach is to consider tier 1 instruction first. It's the place where students spend most of their reading instructional minutes. And actually its job in MTSS is to reduce the number of students who need intervention. That is like the stated role of tier 1 reading instruction. So we don't have enough conversations about that.
And I've seen schools in 1 year's time get incredible growth. 30% of increase in percent of students who meet target benchmarks in 1 year by implementing class-wide intervention. It's an evidence-based strategy easily.
It's amazing.
Closing gaps between student groups.
And so much easier than getting more interventionists and more people to support outside. I mean, you're doing it right there in your actual instruction.
Not only easier, but it actually works better. It's like a double bonus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you all talked about, I mean, we're talking about efficiency here, but I know another thing that you all brought up was this idea of prevention. So how would a school, if they're focusing on prevention instead of, what happens? I taught this and it didn't work. Now what do I do? How does that look different if they're going in with this lens of prevention instead of what's a word I'm looking for here? Not prevention, but
intervention.
Reaction.
Yeah.
How does that versus a reactive is
there
what
you go.
I think you're getting at. But
exactly. So how does this proactive prevention lens look different for schools?
Yeah. So a lot of it is in the questions that we ask. I mean, it's some of the most important things that we do are the road that we go down, the path that we go down is going to be different depending on the questions we ask. When I gave that analogy, right, of an accident. If I'm asking questions about how that accident happened that time, that's what I'm going to react to. If I ask questions about the intersection as a whole, it's gonna take us down a different road. So I think that's a big piece of it, is asking some questions about how, if it's kindergarten in the fall, I want to get those screening data right away, right? And then I want to compare how this kindergarten class's patterns look compared to our previous years, because that's going to tell me how intensive our tier 1 instruction needs to be in order to help students be successful and make the most growth in kindergarten as possible. And so a lot of it is the perspective that we take in the questions that we ask. I mean, universal screening is a preventative practice in and of itself. I don't see schools make dramatic improvements in reading outcomes without having universal screening in place. So not only having it, a place to start would be, if you have universal screening data, seeing how you're using it, right? Like a number of schools that I work with have had these data for years, and they haven't really had the resources, the protocols, the conversations to really take action with those data in a proactive manner.
So asking the question after universal screening, how many students are at risk? How many students scored low on screening? That's the key for me to focusing on prevention. So making sure that that's the first question, not which students are at risk, but how many students are at risk or struggling readers. Other actions that lean towards prevention would be things like putting resources into kindergarten and first grade, putting resources into pre-K, not putting all of your resources into the testing grades, third grade and above, right? Another action would be not waiting until students are behind. So this can be enacted in things like not making students go through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 to get intensive support. So noticing in the data when students might need very intensive support from the very beginning, even from the beginning of kindergarten, and not making kids, fail before they get intensive support, not waiting to take action. Sometimes kindergarten teachers are reluctant. Well, this is their first school experience. I shouldn't, do anything. Maybe I shouldn't even screen until the middle of kindergarten. And I disagree with that. I think that kind of thinking is from that old approach of something outside of the classroom in an intervention framework is going to happen as a result of the screening. And so we're asking folks to shift their thinking there and use the screening data, even at the beginning of kindergarten, to take action through classroom reading instruction first and foremost. And to not wait and see. That's what got us in trouble, in the past, because we know that reading is not just going to magically emerge from students. We have to take an active role in guaranteeing that literacy for all of our students. So acting early, acting in kindergarten, and early in every single grade level.
And Stephanie, you're not saying that we should be pushing our kindergartners to be able to read early fall. But what I'm hearing you say is we're screening them for things like letter names, letter sounds, phonemic awareness, things like that are really going to help them when they're learning to read.
Yes, we're screening on those things because they are predictive of reading comprehension, right? Like they are the age or grade appropriate indicators of the student being on track or not on track. And we should pay attention to that. It's the reason to spend all of that time doing universal screening so that we don't just say, sorry, you're not predicted to be okay. I'm sorry for your luck, but that we actually act on that information with age and grade appropriate instruction, not pushing the curriculum ever downward earlier and earlier, but supporting them with lots of language and then lots of print as well.
So, for example, if we saw in kindergarten in the fall that we had a large number of students who didn't have the phonemic awareness skills that they should have at the beginning of kindergarten, right? They were identified as at risk. I'm not looking to label those students. I'm not saying all of these students need to be pulled out from the classroom for reading instruction, right? And let's make some referrals for special education evaluations. Absolutely not. We're asking about the system right now of kindergarten instruction. And so what I'm going to say is, this year, I'm not going to do the same intensity of phonemic awareness practice that we did last year. I'm actually going to add in some more. So when we're walking in the hallways, when we're standing at the, like maybe I did it once or twice a week before when we were standing waiting for the bath. Now we're going to do it every single time, right? And so it's telling me as a teacher and the grade level, really, what do our students need this year in order to grow enough to be on track at the end of this year? But nobody wants to make kindergartners or kindergarten teachers cry. Like, that's not the goal. That's never the goal.
Excellent.
And so much of what you're both talking about is going to come out later this month too. We have a kindergarten interventionist, I guess SLP, who talks a lot about this idea of proactive kindergarten work. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. And then we also talked with, or I guess we'll talk with, if you're listening, Michelle Hasp. And she talks a lot about making sense of reading assessments and like this idea of universal screeners. So if you're listening right now and you want to hear more about what Stephanie and Sarah are saying about universal screeners, be sure you tune in for the rest of the month and also grab their book that we'll link in the show notes.
All right. Before we wrap up, I know, we talked a lot about some misunderstandings between like what is actually MTSS. And I know that you all probably hear way more than we do about some misunderstandings of MTSS and what it is and what it's not. So I'm going to just open the floor for you all to talk about what are some things that you hear come up that you're like, we want to just dispel that rumor now. That's not what MTSS is. So what are they?
I'll start with one. MTSS is not a rigid set of procedures that must look the same in every school, grade level, or every district. It is not a set of procedures that you put in a binder or a flow chart and then push out to everybody and expect consistency in. It is a framework by design. There are these components Sarah mentioned earlier that might be called different things, based on different people implementing MTSS, but those core components exist in the school, but how they look even will vary grade by grade within a school because it's all about making decisions based on student data. And students look different. The resources are different in every school. What it takes to get change to happen will look different in every school. So I would encourage people to recognize that this is by design a flexible framework, and they need to contextualize what's in the research to the reality of their school and the needs of their students.
I love that, Stephanie. One of the things that I hear often is confusion about the pyramid, and it circles around a lot of this conversation that we've had today. But the MTSS pyramid we often think of as containing the students in our schools. So we hear school leaders and educators say all of our tier 3 students are our yellow students, or we have an upside down pyramid, right? And we know exactly what that means. We can see the picture in our head of what, like, I know what that means for that school. It changes though. It's not at all. It's not what an MTSS is intended to be. And if we shift to a different perspective, it actually is more effective and efficient. The pyramid does not contain students. It contains our resources. And so when we think back to those classes, when Melissa, you mentioned earlier, it's an interesting way to think about class-wide intervention, tier 1 intervention, as opposed to getting more interventionists, right? If I think I have an upside down pyramid, then I think I need more interventionists, right? And more time and a different schedule. Maybe I need all of that. If I take the perspective of, we have a lot of students who have a lot of needs, where do we have the most resources in our system? Tier 1. So now we're going to look to see how we can support with the resources that we have. That also includes then It helps in several different ways because it also keeps us from thinking about, oh, the student's getting tier 3. It's a tier 3 student, so they don't need tier 1. Some of those other things that are kind of encompassed in that. But that's a big thing that I see that I think is helpful to reframe.
That's groundbreaking. I know. I'm sure a lot of teachers out there are listening like, oh my gosh, my school has been putting students into those categories. And yeah, let's think about it in terms of resources. I love this. Okay.
You're not alone. If your school is doing it, you're not alone. But the podcast isn't all about the pyramid. And so I'm trying, so I don't want to, but we start to expect and accept that some students are going to be forever at risk in reading because they're tier 3 students, as instead of our tier 2 and our tier 3 resources, we put a lot of time into and a lot of work into and a lot of like love into for our interventionists and our folks who are support, right? Like in those resources. And so we do that because we need to accelerate student progress, not because they're a tier 3 student and they're always going to be at risk.
So helpful. All right. Well, I know one thing that is important to all of us, since this is a really tough conversation in terms of like understanding for teachers, right? We have teachers out there listening who might feel like, okay, I'm in my classroom. I have a broken system around me. I'm going to think about what I can control within my own system. Maybe there's a teacher listening who's thinking, okay, I'm in a system that's trying to work. It's maybe working toward the right track here. We're all on board. We're going for it. So there's a variety of listeners out there, but I think it might be helpful for everyone, regardless of where you are in your MTSS journey, to think about what's working. And you two are the best people to share because you're out there doing this work with schools and districts all the time. So I'm hopeful that you can share some bright spots around strong systems and what works within those systems. Like what's going well?
Yeah, thank you for asking this because I don't think we bring those bright spots forward enough. And Sarah and I are really privileged and honored to get to be working and walking alongside of schools that are getting tremendous results. So just off the top of my head, some of the things that I see working are individual teachers being brave enough to just start something. Right. And sometimes this happens in a kind of revolutionary, rebellious way. Like you all know, just close your door and do something different. And sometimes it's more part of a school-wide effort. Right. But showing the results. So teachers who will do something different, demonstrate improvement, better outcomes for their students, and then they will quietly share that. Maybe just with other teachers at their grade level, maybe with a trusted interventionist or school psychologist within the school, maybe with the principal. And then people take notice, right? Like, what are you doing over there that's getting results? I have kids just like yours, and I didn't get results like that. What are you doing over there? That's been really powerful. Like Sarah mentioned earlier, we see school systems that are getting tremendous improvements across one school year, even doubling their percentage of students who are on track. And don't be afraid to start small in your own classroom or do something like a pilot. I've seen this be very, very effective if you are a school leader or you're working with a school leader who's willing to give this a try. Demonstrate at a single grade level that you can improve outcomes, or just within your school, and then take that success to the rest of the district so that you don't have to try this like across the board at every grade level in every school in your district as a starting place. So I've observed that sort of incremental change, sharing the success stories, sharing the data improvement to be a really effective strategy.
I also really appreciate you asking this question. So I'll just share this year, one of the schools that I was a special education director in my last role in a school district. And I never get like celebration emails. And now in my current work as a consultant, I get some celebration emails and it's really exciting for me. So one of those this year was a school that I work with that shared their data, and they had gone after having learned, everybody was trained in the science of reading several years ago. They've had a research aligned good program as part of their tier one for several years now. And they've been using screening and progress monitoring for several years. And they were seeing pretty stagnant growth. And this year they put in place two things. So one, they did class-wide intervention, which we've talked about. And two, they really did intentional data team meetings, like supporting and having conversations, not just about the data, but what to do next, helping teachers move past kind of looking at the data to taking action on it. And then when they did have celebrations, attributed those celebrations and just say, look at what we achieved, but here's what we did to do it, right? Like asking that next question of, oh, what did you do in your classroom to get that? So that we don't just attribute it to students. It kind of finally clicked, right, for the student, but like, oh, we worked really hard. Let's talk about that so that we can replicate it. And in this school, they managed to, they had a 4-section kindergarten. They grew their percent of students who were on track from the last several years, it was stagnant, to over 30% growth in 1 year. And every single section reached over 80% of students. Every single section had at least like 13 or 15% of student growth over because of 1 year of change. And they talk about, obviously, celebrating the student outcomes is the best part, but they also talk about that having the conversations as a team and building that teamwork around data use and taking action in reading also has changed their culture around reading improvement and data use to help them support their students. And so I think both of those things are huge celebrations that I've heard, obviously, from that school that I described, but other schools too that I also am very fortunate to get the opportunity to support. But those are things that I see that I think are helpful for students, but also great for the system, right? And great for teachers.
And we love hearing those things that work. And those emails are the best, aren't they, Sarah?
They're fantastic.
Yeah, I just have to say, I mean, you all, I know MTSS can, even for me, sometimes it's like, okay, this is, getting ready for this podcast, I was like, this feels like a daunting topic, right? It does feel like it's a little more intense, right? It always feels that way. And this conversation really made me realize, like, it is hard, right? But the reason it's hard is like because we're asking people to make changes, and I love the things you said, and they're probably all through your book of like, if we're asking the right questions and we're thinking about MTSS in this big systems way and what's working and what's not working, and being open to making those changes, it doesn't have to be as daunting, and it can really lead to some great success. So thank you all for sharing everything today and helping me feel like MTS isn't as daunting as it seems sometimes.
Well, thank you for inviting us and for asking such great questions. It was a pleasure to talk with both of you.
Truly a pleasure. Thank you.